welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My name is Mark Powell, and as per usual, this podcast is all about really equipping and resourcing the church to better serve Christ in the world. And my special guest with me today is Andrew Wilson from the UK. Andrew is a pastor and author, prolific author, in fact, and his new book is called Remaking the World: How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West, published by Crossway, and it's just been released. Andrew, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Mark. It's a great joy to be down under for once.
Yeah, well, look, we're not going to get into the cricket or anything like that. We'll keep it all very edifying. But I do have to ask, this is Profiles in Christian Living, and the first thing I always want to ask every guest is, how did you yourself become a Christian? What was the events that led you to faith in Christ?
So my mum and dad both got converted in the 10 days before they got married. So they were from non-Christian families, both of them, and they were dating and wanted to get married. And then in that final week, basically, both came to faith separately from one another. And so their marriage from that point on was like, wow, this is quite a radical change at the last minute. My dad, actually, some listeners would know the name Dick Lucas, but from St Helens Bishopsgate in London. My dad came to faith in Dick's flat, and it was pretty transformative for both of them, and they had to completely rethink everything. And then it meant that when I was born, the family has always been just like brought into a very strong Christian environment, and probably never didn't believe it, but didn't live it. As is often the way, sadly, I guess, on and off as a teenager, particularly at university, I really wandered from God, and then came back to God in my last year at Cambridge, when I was 21, through some strong friends. I suddenly got very into Tom Wright's work, and his big book on the resurrection was just a real kind of, wow, this really happened. This is not just something I've been raised to believe. This is, I actually believe this, and I haven't really looked back since I was about 22, 23. So it's, in that sense, it's quite a sort of standard story for someone raised in a Christian home. But I think in a strange way, yes, the miracle for me in my Christian life happened the week before my mum and dad got married, which is, that's almost where the breakthrough from nowhere came. So yeah, I'm remarkably grateful for my family, but I haven't had one of those sort of dramatic, oh gosh, I've never believed this, and suddenly I do. It wasn't like that in my case.
Yeah, look, as the father of 6 children myself, my prayer all the way along has been that they would never have that dramatic testimony, that there would never be a day they didn't know Christ. So it's a wonderful, wonderful heritage to be brought up by Christian parents.
Yeah, it is.
Andrew, you studied at Oxford, and you've gone on to do your
Cambridge.
PhD.
Cambridge. I mean, you can say what you like about the cricket, but don't go there.
My apologies, Cambridge. You've also done your PhD at King's College, London. What led you to go into pastoral ministry?
Well, so I'm a very, very charismatic background. I don't know how the Presbyterian Church in Australia is on these things, but I'm from a very charismatic background, and I think just God spoke very clearly in a prophetic ministry time, which is going to sound odd to some, I'm sure, but I was thinking, do I go down the academic route? And I wasn't sure about that, and I was considering it, and this extraordinary word from a young woman I had never met, I still don't even remember her name, just completely cut through all of the things that I was deliberating, and spoke very clearly to me that God is calling you to be a pastor and not go down the academic route. And she didn't know me at all. Like, it was just bizarre. And I knew it was God speaking to me. So that's maybe not how everybody makes decisions in life, but it then at the same time, I think some opportunities opened up, and I sort of gradually grew into it, rather than I dropped my job in the city in London to go and work for a church, but that wasn't really being a pastor. That was running a little training course, and over 6 or 7 years, it basically grew from that into a pastoral role. But I think the short answer is I really believe God called me, and God spoke to me very clearly at a particular age, and have done that ever since, and I've never felt to leave. But I wanted to have had the privilege, because I'm in part of quite a large church, of being able to balance some of these academic and research interests, as reflected, I guess, in this book, but in other things I've done, and do spend quite a lot of time writing and studying alongside pastoral ministry. And that obviously isn't something every church can sustain, because a lot of churches, the pastor's the only person on the staff. He's got to do all the weddings and funerals and all that stuff. And in my case, that isn't true. So I have had the privilege of being able to do a lot of research as well as being a sort of regular, what we call a teaching pastor in the church.
Yeah, that's really insightful because as I read your book, and actually I first of all listened to it, and I must say you've got this the perfect voice for audiobook. If those listening, normally I read books. In this case, I was incapacitated due to a mountain bike accident, and I was lying in bed feeling sorry for myself. And immediately I was struck by just how great your voice sounds on audio. Have you done this before for audiobooks?
I read my very first book as an audiobook. That was in 2008. But I didn't really enjoy the experience. I don't think I did it that well. And then I thought, I know no good at this. I don't like it. And then came back to it for this one, and I did a little Twitter poll, and I said, guys, would you rather have it read by an expert or read by the person who wrote it? Thinking everyone was, oh no, a professional. And then loads of people said, oh no, it's loads better when the author does it. And I've actually just been asked to do it's really fun, a kid's Bible, which I'm a passionate advocate of already. But then they've asked me to do the voice for that as well, because I think they like this. So I love that. I mean, I talk too fast, as you can see, in normal conversation, but in audiobook form, reading it makes you slow down. And I really enjoyed it. It was great.
Yeah, look, I think you did a fantastic job, and I look forward to hearing your children's Bible because you do have a great gift to be able to come across so
Thank you.
clearly. But I mean, it's not just I don't want to. It sounds so superficial to talk about the sound of your voice. It's very helpful, but I was just so impressed by the breadth of your reading and your research. What led you to write this particular book?
I was on holiday in France. With my family, and I read a sentence really, in a book by a guy called Ian Morris, who is he's not a Christian. He's a sort of a bit of a polymath, really. Writes history and archaeology and all sorts of things. And he was writing a book about why the West has been developmentally ahead of the East for much of the last 500 years, and why that's now changing, and why the East is overtaking. And that was the conceit of the book. But in the course of it, he, in one sentence, I think, or two sentences, said that The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith was published in 1776, and that was the same year that the James Watt steam engine started running in the Midlands in Britain. And I thought, wow, that's those two events, arguably the key step in industrial history and the most important textbook in economic history, running alongside in the same year as the Declaration of Independence, which I obviously knew was in 1776 as well. And I thought, that's a remarkable cocktail of three things. What an interesting thing. And just didn't think much more about it. Had a little Google online, like, what else happened in this year, and found a few other, wow, Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and a few other things, but kind of part the thought. But at the same time, I was reading books by the American psychologists Joseph Henrich and Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, really influenced me. And they use this acronym WEIRD to describe the West: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And I was really interested by that as a way of describing what's distinctive about the West, and they've had lots of reasons for that research and why they use that term. And I don't remember quite when it was. I think I might have been in the shower, but the two ideas sort of collided at once. I thought I'd like to write about 1776 because I'd like to study it more, at least. It's just interesting. And then the weird idea, I thought, oh, hang on, what if I could tell the story of the post-Christian West through using that acronym through the lens of 1 year? Because I'm a pastor who's interested in cultural apologetics. As a preacher, I'm always trying to connect what the Word of God says to the cultural challenges and reflections of the day, and help the people of God live in it and reach their unbelieving friends. And so the idea of doing an explainer on the post-Christian world, to me, is like quite an obvious thing for a pastor. Even you might not write a book on it, but it's obviously something you need to do in ministry in some form. And what then happened with this idea was, I thought, well, the challenge with ever telling the story of the post-Christian West is making the story small enough, because there's just so much stuff you could say. And as you said already, there's just already a lot of things I had to read and write in this book. But I realized that identifying on 1 year could be a conceit that would make the story small enough to tell it plausibly, and say, we're just going to drill into this 1 year, and we're going to meet all these characters, and then we're going to track those developments of Westernization, Enlightenment, industrialization, democracy, and so on through this 1 year, and then in doing so, hopefully provide a window into our own day. So that's, I think, how it happened. But to be honest, ideas are strange. They come to you rather than being things you create yourself. And so I'm not 100% sure how it happened, but that's my version of the story.
I'd love to drill down at some point too on your process of writing, but before we get to that, now you tweak that dynamic or that paradigm with a weird as in
Yeah.
ex-Christian and also romantic. As you started to really develop that schema, was there anything that really surprised you about how significant those events were and how it shaped us today?
Yes. Yes, there definitely were. So when I first had, in lots of things actually, when I first had the idea, I knew I was going to talk about steam engine and the Industrial Revolution and the American Revolution. But even in the story I've just told, I thought I was going to do a lot on, let's say, Adam Smith and economic theory.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I got into it that I realized that the reason this period in history is so significant for economics is not really because Adam Smith wrote a book. I thought that there was a connection. I just didn't know, but I'd assumed there was a connection between the way people thought about free markets and maybe I'd swallowed some free market gubbins from various places. But I thought that that's why the West started growing economically. I didn't realize that Adam Smith was sort of explaining why the West wasn't doing very well economically and why they should change policies, while the wealth of the world was increasing, and he didn't even realize it was, because obviously statistics only showed that sometime later. And so actually that section was all about the economic miracle, really, or the great enrichment or whatever. That I was astounded to find that if you did a graph of economic growth across human history, GDP per person, you'd find it's like a hockey stick that effectively starts shooting upwards literally in the 1770s. And that's partly to do with the Industrial Revolution and some other things. So that was a huge surprise. That was one of the big developments, and I thought I didn't even realize that was a factor. I think the real aha bombshell moment for me was when I discovered, and for a lot of people in the States, this has been the real, ooh, I never knew that thing about my book, which is this discovery that Benjamin Franklin crossed out Thomas Jefferson's original draft in the Declaration of Independence, and that what Jefferson had originally suggested was we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, and Franklin replaced it with self-evident. And I didn't know that had happened either. I don't think it's very well known even in the States. And so I've had this fascinating experience of lots of Americans saying, wow, we never knew that about this document that's very precious to us. But that was I read that, I was like, this is too good to be true. I had to really check it out because I thought that is such a wonderful parable of what the post-Christian West has done, which is to say these Christian truths that we believe because they're sacred, which is what Jefferson rightly said, we're now just going to take for granted and assume that they're self-evident. And I use it not so much as a cause, but more as a parable of that wider development. And then on the romantics as well, I didn't know. I'd studied it a bit at university, but I didn't know loads about. I certainly knew very little about German Romanticism, which is really where it was happening at the time. And so I had to study a lot on that, and again met some. I didn't know much about Casanova, who was a name I knew, but I knew nothing about him. But he was one of the most astonishing characters I met in writing the book. So there's a lot I learned, loads. It was fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many things which you mentioned. I thought, I've got to follow that up. And thanks to you, I bought like 2 more books, because I thought I knew nothing about Marcus Tassati. And I thought, oh, wow, that's a person I should at least have an appreciation for.
Oh, he's a dark, dark man, isn't he? My goodness.
Yeah. One of the things that really impressed me about your book was just the breadth of reading. And I think one of your real strengths is how you synthesize all of that information so that it's not simplistic but nuanced and yet still clear. What's your process of reading and researching and writing to bring all of that information together?
So I think it's probably worth saying that the context of writing and reading for this book was lockdown, and this probably my Australian friends can probably relate to this more than the Americans who I've spoken to, because for many of my American friends, the lockdown. I mean, I've literally got friends who are like, "Oh yeah, we were locked down for 2 weeks," and then they just went back to work. I mean, I know that's not true everywhere, but so they don't get this. But I was like, you would, I probably, I'm sure, in parts
Yeah.
of your country where it was much more draconian over a long period. And so, really, for the best part of 2 years, lockdowns are on and off. That you're very limited in what you can do, and that. Probably without that, I don't think I would have been able to do this book. Although at the time I hated lockdown, I'm a very extroverted person, and I really hate not being able to hug my family. I mean, or my parents. I mean, that was awful. But actually, from a ministry point of view, I can look back now and say that did really help because I think I just had to buy. I'm a real one for paper books, so I'm not really an audiobook guy like you, or maybe you weren't either. And so I basically bought lots of books. You couldn't go to libraries; they're all shut. So I just lots of Amazon deliveries appearing. My church is generous to me on that kind of thing, and sort of gives me some leeway to buy books if they think it's important. So I did, and I read loads. I marked them all up. I couldn't really do much else, to be honest. And once the children were back in school, the first lockdown was very different. But once the children were in school, but other things were still closed, I would just be reading a lot and sitting in a small room in an industrial estate in my hometown. So not the most ideal place for creativity, but just reading loads and annotating. And I think that's probably the reason. I don't think I could do that in a normal. Well, I definitely couldn't do that in a normal 2 year window. It would have taken me far, far longer. But lockdown meant that most of the normal ministry things we do were shut down for a season. I preach on Sundays onto Zoom or to a camera, but I couldn't do much of what normal ministry is. And this gave me something to do. So that probably, in this particular case, is how it happened. I think my normal process is not dissimilar, but it is just much less wide-ranging. So you just don't have to read as much or write as much, as literally as many words as I did on this particular one.
Yeah, there was one particular chapter I think I really appreciated being, in the Southern Hemisphere, which was the chapter on Western and the influence
Yeah,
of James Cook. And you had a particular quote from one of the Polynesians that were traveling with him, Mahane, um, good people, bad land. And you make that a bit of a paradigm for a lot of why the West, not all, but a lot of why the West succeeded. Can you explain what you meant by that?
yeah. I mean, that was another one of those things I'd obviously discovered on the way that I thought was too good to be true because, again, it struck me in 4 words. This young man who history's pretty much forgotten, really, except for experts. This young Polynesian man summarizes, really, I think, the best of what we know about development studies. Really, why is it? I mean, obviously, it's a fashionable field in the last generation. And the reason he said it is because he's traveling with. James Cook arrives in Polynesia, and it's one of these fascinating dynamics of Western expansion, where the Western ship arrives and they think that they're using the natives and taking the natives with them as their trophies. But of course, the natives are simultaneously using them because they're going, well, hang on, this might give me an opportunity to see a much wider scene and perhaps to get you to support my claim to this bit of land or this, in some cases, this royal claim, all that stuff. So it's fascinating dialogue that's taking place. And this young man travels with Cook a while and he ends up going to Easter Island, what we now call Easter Island. And he looks at, as they all do, all Westerners are looking at this island and thinking, this is very strange because these people look just like the Polynesians we know from what we now call Tahiti. But their stage of development is a lot further back. And not just that, it looks like these people are much less developed than they were only a couple of 100 years ago because they built these incredible statues, which of course people today still marvel at. So how is it that they used to have the technology to do that, but now they don't? And the Western people are trying to figure it out. And this young man says, in his own language, it's good people, bad land. That there's nothing wrong with the people here. The people are the same as my people, he's saying. But the land simply can't support the same level of, agriculture. And it doesn't even things like it doesn't have enough wood or it doesn't, those sorts of things where there just aren't enough trees. There's been an ecological crisis of some sort which has taken place. I mean, he didn't go into all of this detail, but we now know that what he said was essentially right. And what I then do is to use that as a paradigm, as you say, not just for what happened at Rapa Nui or Easter Island, but for what's happened across the world, which is that the reason why some societies develop faster than others is not because the people are innately superior, or even mainly because of cultural factors, but because the land's better, because they have navigable rivers and they have sufficient fresh water and they have crops that can be ground and made portable and can be stored in terms of storable wealth. And because they're domesticated animals, like horses and sheep and pigs and cows, are things which can obviously create enough food to feed people and enough skin to clothe people. Whereas if you live in Southern Africa or Australia and you've got to try and domesticate kangaroos and farm wallabies, I mean, it's not going to go so well as it does if you have sheep everywhere. And so, as I got into that, I realized, I mean, obviously that's not a new argument at all. It's something that many anthropologists have been saying, but I found that a really helpful way of considering Westernization. And I wrote about it because I think if you don't have some version of that story, you slip into, if not outright racism, you will probably still slip into some version of cultural superiority, whereby Western ideas are just better. And because Western ideas are better, we're richer, or we discovered steam before everyone else. And I don't think that's true at all. I think this is because the people who lived in West Asia in the Bronze Age and the people who lived in Eastern China in the Bronze Age had a significant set of advantages that meant that they, as civilizations, were going to advance further and faster than everyone else because of that. And so Mahine was right. That's my claim in that chapter.
Yeah, because of your book, and I think because of the podcast you did with Glenn Scrivener, who's also written an excellent book, The Air We Breathe. And can I just say, I think the podcast series that you're doing at the moment for the Gospel Coalition, Post Christianity, is excellent. And anybody listening to this, really recommend listening to that 8-part series. Really great job. One of the things that you developed from Heinrich, and his book, The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and particularly Prosperous, is you developed 2 more categories of ex-Christian and also romantic. I was really intrigued with the ex-Christian part. You cover really well Voltaire and Hume and others, but you talk about also the impact of the Protestant Reformation for the breakdown of Christendom. I can imagine a lot of Protestants would go, wait a minute, what are you saying? We contributed to ex-Christianity. How would you defend that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's and of course I'm one of those Protestants who goes, wait a minute, I think that the short version of that is that I don't think modernity and what we now think of as secularism or a post-Christian West or whatever we call it could ever have happened without the Protestant Reformation. You know the Irish joke about the guy who says, I want to get to Dublin, and he says, oh no, you can't get to Dublin from here. To get to Dublin, you have to go over there and then get there from there. And I think it's a little bit like that with medieval Catholicism couldn't get to contemporary secularism. Protestantism was a necessary staging post on the way, or something very like it. Not the doctrinal components, but the sense of destabilization and division within the monolithic medieval Western Church. Without that division and without the wars that came from it, and I think also without the sort of loss of institutional and doctrinal authority in the one voice of Mother Church, you would never have got secularism. And so Protestantism, and obviously I'm a passionate Protestant. All the 95 theses and 5 points, and I mean I would score pretty much every question on the Heidelberg Catechism, even though I'm a Baptist charismatic pastor. I'm all there for Protestantism and for the Reformation documents, but I think it's hard to argue against the idea that in the context of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was an enormously divisive and destabilizing force that meant that as soon as states begin to say, we read the Bible this way, and area, state is probably anachronistic, but even in this part of Germany, we read it this way, and in that part of Germany, they read it that way. At some point, something like secularism becomes almost inevitable, I think, that at some stage, people are going to have to say, for us to live together in a shared polity, we're either going to have to form basically quite what we would now think of as fundamentalist religious enclaves that don't attempt to unite, or we are going to have to come together in some sort of common space where some of those religious distinctives we hold are are still held, but they don't dominate the public square. And we have to have a quote neutral. Now we all know it's not neutral public square, but we attempt to build a neutral public space so that we can all collaborate together. And maybe there are other ways that could have come about, but I think that was a necessary product, I think, of Protestantism. And that's quite a Catholic argument, as in lots of, Brad Gregory and Charles Taylor and many of the people who've made this argument are themselves Catholics of various stripes. What I don't do, though, is to say, therefore, the Protestant Reformation is to blame. And if I can quote a fellow Presbyterian of yours, Carl Trueman, he's just got a lovely line on this where he just says, hey, you guys screwed up first, is his kind of response where he's saying, effectively, the Protestant Reformation is the response to a series of abuses in the medieval church, without which Protestantism wouldn't have been necessary as a reform movement. And actually, medieval Catholicism was not monolithic, and there were already divisions and abuses built into it. So I'm not blaming Luther for whatever, gay marriage or whatever you care to mention. It's not that. But I do think that you wouldn't have got to the secular public square we have now without Protestantism as a staging post. And I talk about the modern West and our religious landscape as being one of Protestant paganism, which I feel still is pretty good description of it, that spiritually we are pagan in the sense that we think the sacred is within the world and not beyond it. We are oneists rather than twoists in Peter Jones's language. There's just this world. But our moral impulse and fervour is very Protestant. And even I don't know how much it reached Australia, but even in the sort of fallout from the death of George Floyd in 2020, the ways that people responded by, obviously cancelling public figures, tearing down statues, iconoclasm. You think this looks very like the Protestant Reformation. This is exactly what Protestants did. They said these images of people, the old is gone. These guys are, need to be torn down and replaced with new images for a new era. And you think, wow, that at a sociological level, it looks quite like the Reformation. And so we have that kind of moral conviction and animation and passion mingled with a very pagan spirituality. And I think it's the fusion of the two that makes us distinctive as Western people in a religious sense.
Yeah. Look, so much to say in response. I totally agree. I think George Floyd's death significantly rippled across the pond, to England, to Australia. It was in the midst of COVID here. We were all in lockdown. We had, some of the tightest restrictions in the world. You were arrested if you, would go out in public. And yet, in the midst of that, the police allowed a Black Lives Matter demonstration with no repercussions. It was phenomenal in terms of its inconsistency. But it's interesting you mention Carl Trueman, because your book, in some ways for me, felt like a segue to his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, particularly your last acronym, or the letter in the acronym, Romantic. Can you just give our listeners a bit of a précis for why the Romantic period was so important for the rise and triumph of the modern self?
Yeah, so this is obviously Carl's field, and he was a guest on the podcast with me and Glenn just in last week's episode, and he really has helped me on this. He actually spoke at our theological conference on classical theism, actually, but during lockdown. So while this is all going on, so I got an early proof of his book to look at. He was very kind with that. And it's a huge. So his story really is that a very helpful way of telling the narrative of what's happening in the modern West now in the 2020s is the all-powerful self that really traces its roots back to the early romantics and pre-romantics, so people like Rousseau, and the way in which people in the late 18th century began to conceive of the self as the most important component of the human. The most important thing about you is who you are on the inside, is not what you're given by your nation or tribe or religious identity or family, which is how almost all human beings have thought. But what's really distinctive about you is what you feel in here, and then discover it, and then you project that identity out into the world. And that's why the dramatic rise of identity and selfhood language in the modern West that's where it comes from. It's got its roots there. And Carl does a fantastic intellectual genealogy of that journey. So what is interesting, I mean, his book and my book are very different, though, because what he does is, of course, to take one of the 7 developments I look at and follow it in quite a lot of detail through the last 200 years. And I do the opposite. I say, no, I'm going to follow 7 developments in 1 year and then almost jump to today. And so he's sort of, if you the analogy of like he's following the wood down the trunk of the tree, and I'm doing a slice through 1 year and looking at seven different things. But actually, as you say, I think the stories do overlap in really important ways. And I think that the reason what you see in the late 18th century, I love the fact that in 1776, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is writing his Reveries of a Solitary Walker, and really making these remarkable comments about sort of, I look into myself, I find what's truly there. I've got to live in line with what he calls my sincérité de cœur, my sincerity of heart, or we might now call it authenticity. He talks a lot about veracité, which again might mean truthfulness, but he means something more like sort of integrity or living in line with what I think the truth is. And so it's not far from there to sort of living my truth kind of thing. And he's a fascinating guy. But at the same time, I then talk about, as I mentioned, Casanova and Goethe and others. Casanova, the first person I think in history to tell his life story through the lens of his sex life, which now is almost inconceivable that someone would write a gripping biography of someone without even mentioning their marriage and their sex life, because it just seems so basic to us about what identity is about. But at the time, that had never really happened, and Rousseau does it to a degree. And so I tell a number of those stories as Carl, whereas what Carl does, I think, is more starts with the ideas and then follows them through. Whereas I tell more of those different stories in one period, and obviously blend it with a story that's. I don't want to overplay the significance of the ideas, because were it not for the technological and material developments of the 19th century, the way in which that identity language has played out today wouldn't have happened. And one of the reasons, so yes, you could say partly, gender transitioning is a product of those ideas, but it's also partly just a product of industrial technology, and it's also partly a product of political factors and economic growth and all sorts of other things. So I'm trying to tell a story that's got 7 threads to it, and say these developments are a product of all of these things, right through, by the way, to the protests you mentioned in 2020, which are an obvious example of how a number of these factors all play together.
Yeah, I found your book so compelling that I thought I've got to write a book review on this, because I really want to promote your book. I want people to read it. I think it's a really significant book. I think personally one of the most important books published, at least in the last 5 years, because it just gives us such understanding on why we are who we are today. And yet, as I was writing the review, I thought, I can't just write a review. I've got to summarize some of these things, because you're bringing together so many things, and giving. At first, I thought, 1776. Surely that's just a little bit of like sermon rhetoric. And then, as you presented your case, I went, there you go. It all happened. What do you hope people take away practically from your book?
So I think in some ways the first thing, it's going to sound odd because it's not practical at all, but the first thing that I want for people from the book is I want them to really enjoy reading it. I want them to think it's a good story. I know that sounds very facile, and in a way it is, but I really want people to read it and go, that was really compelling and gripping. And I think if you're writing for lots of people, you want them to feel it's a really fun story to read. So I've had that. I would say that's
Oh,
probably
look,
the
you
primary.
did that. That was
Well,
brilliant.
in your case, but thank you very much, Mark. But so that is, in a way, I feel is job one, because sometimes we can read a story and it doesn't necessarily have a practical. So as it happens, I was reading a novel by Graham Greene as I was going to sleep last night. Graham Greene's novels have zero practical application in any of them, but they have actually, over time, they really shape you, and you think go back to them over and over again because they get in your mind. It's like Inception, you put ideas in people. So I think that's what I'm saying. I do then have 2 chapters towards the end of the book where I talk quite a lot about the way in which I think the church can and should respond to some of these developments. I think different readers will respond to them in different ways. I think it's helpful for our hymnody, our songs, our liturgy, a choice of songs. I think it can be helpful to articulate, as hymns, ballooning in the 1770s. A lot of our great hymns were written in that decade, and even in that 1 year. I hope that can be an encouragement to people. I'd really like to persuade people, particularly in more conservative circles, I think, of a holistic vision of Christian freedom, which I talk quite a lot about, again, through the lens both of abolitionism and religious freedom, but also the sort of freedom from the enslavement of the sinful nature, and to try and present a 3D vision of freedom, which I've done in other books as well. I feel very passionate about that. And I hope there's some application there actually for the way we lead through complex, moral issues in the public square even today. I'm a pastor in a black majority church in London. That's where I'm speaking from right now. And I think that's sort of some of the implications of this story for even the way we handle race relations in the world today, and the way we respond to things like what happened a few years ago, are really important. And then I also have an application point on, so there's a bit on grace, a bit on freedom, and a bit on truth. And I think helping people join the dots between show people that really a lot of the assumptions of the modern world depend on Christian foundations, and that if you take those foundations away, the beliefs might not survive, but therefore there's a great opportunity for the Christian to show how those. I basically, as I say in the podcast with Glenn, it's much easier to say to unbelievers, "Here's what you believe, and here's why you're right," than "Here's what you believe, and here's why you're wrong." And I hope that the book helps people see why that's true. That discussion we had about Protestant paganism, I think, can help. And then that touches on lots of areas which are very pressing today, like identity, status, privilege, things which are very, particularly among a sort of more educated, graduate-y, younger demographic, really pressing issues, which I think we can help people navigate and see why Christian foundations for them are much stronger and much more restful. Like, I'd love people to get to the end of the book and go, "Oh, thank the Lord that God has done what I needed him to do for me, and that I don't have to establish my own identity and project it into the world, because ultimately God has done that for me in Christ and given it to me as a gift." I'd love people to experience restfulness and grace as a result of reading it too. So I've
Yeah,
got a lot of ambitions.
it's interesting you say that, because as you started, I thought, okay, everything's falling apart. Like Western Christendom, it's all coming apart at the seams. But by the end of the book, even at no part did I feel like I lost hope. And in fact, at the end of the book, I felt actually strangely encouraged, which was really weird. Weirder than the weirdest thing of all was you gave a wonderful sense of God's providence throughout all of these developments. And it was like, okay, I had a better understanding of the world. And I worked with a senior minister once at the previous church I was at, and he said, sometimes the practical application of a sermon is a right understanding of God and his ways. And I thought, oh, yeah,
Yes.
that's the feeling I got after I finished your book. Yes, it was a delight to read. Yes, it was a delight to listen to in this first case, although I did go back and read it in hard copy form. But at the end of the day, you talk about grace, freedom, and truth. Can you explain, whet our appetite here for those that haven't read your book yet? Why did you land there?
So I wanted to consider the church's response in the 1770s to the developments that were taking place. I knew that there were a lot of significant things that had happened in that decade from a church point of view. I knew that, that was when Newton and Cooper were writing the Olney hymns, and Toplady. I didn't know that Toplady had written this lovely meditation on providence at the start of 1776, but I used that. A guy on Twitter got in touch about that. It was very helpful. I knew, obviously, in the story of abolitionism, very important, so freedom, and the story of religious freedom in America. Again, I learned more about that, but some of the key contributions of people like James Madison on that. What I didn't, the new one that was new to me, is that I wanted to talk about something to do with truth and the connection between the Christian foundations or the Christian roots and the Christian shoots. Because I think what modern people are doing primarily is say, well, we've got the fruit, which is compassion, mercy, justice. The case Glenn Scrivener makes in his book. We've got all of that, so we don't need the roots anymore. And I just wanted to push back on that and say, no, in the end, those things probably won't survive without these foundations. But I got to that through I think the most compelling and brilliant person that I met in the whole research of the book, who is a German, almost unknown in English-speaking settings, a German philosopher, theologian, and genius called Johann Georg Hamann, who was a friend of Kant's, and he had, Hegel and Goethe and Kierkegaard and many others praised him as like one of the most brilliant people who's ever lived. Kierkegaard said he's up there with Socrates as one of the two brightest guys who's ever lived. Like pretty, fulsome praise. But he's a Lutheran Christian theologian who critiques the Enlightenment on its own terms while it's still going on, and basically writes this. Kant writes his critique of pure reason, and Hamann writes his meta critique of the purism of reason from a Christian perspective. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And now that will not be the bit that most lights up some readers. They'll go, "This is just probably too heavy." But for me, he was the most stimulating person to engage with, because he's just very funny as well as very brilliant in the full sense. And so I wanted to talk there about the case he makes and how that can help Christians effectively ground a Christian theology of truth in the public square. And so those in Grace, Freedom and Truth, and they're all taking place in 1776. So I found that the year, again, that device of going to 1 year, allowed me to narrow the focus onto a handful of key individuals: Olaudah Equiano, John Newton, a woman called Rebecca Proton, who many people will never have heard of, as a Moravian missionary who was a former slave who then did the slave trade in reverse and ended up back in Ghana as a missionary, and Hamann, and would tell some of these stories to introduce people to some of these themes, and then in the final chapter apply them to the world today and say, here's how grace, freedom and truth help us with many of these great challenges.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think you've done a masterful job of keeping it all together. Was there any really areas like red herrings where you thought, I really want to chase that idea over there, but I just don't have time? Is there anything you'd love to come back to and explore further?
Oh, it definitely was, and I was thinking about it the other day, and it's now going to escape me. There was a whole set of stories that I just, it's escaped me what it was, but that's annoying, because I was thinking about this just the other day. It was like, I thought about it at the time, and I thought I would write a lot more about a particular thing, but I think there was another part of the world. Oh, that's what it was. Yes, I've just remembered. So it was that another major thing that was taking place in the 1770s. In fact, one of the people whose malign influence on the last 20 years has been stronger than most, is effectively the founder of Wahhabism. And I would love to have given some exploration, the Wahhabist tradition in Islam, and which is connected with obviously Osama bin Laden and many others. The man from whom that gets its name was also alive and well, and growing in influence in 1776. And at one point I thought I would do some things about what was happening in the Arab world, what was happening in Jerusalem, what was going to happen in Islam, because that's obviously shaped the modern world as well. But in the end, it just didn't fit the story of the post-Christian West I was telling, and I just thought, I just can't. You can't do everything. But at one point, I was doing a bunch of research on what was happening in the Middle East, and that's a part of the world that really, at least in the modern period, I completely left out of the book, as I had
Yeah,
to for many
that
parts.
is fascinating, because Britain is now so multicultural. And it seems to me, looking at social media at least, it's becoming increasingly Islamicized. And so it would be fascinating to see that sort of exploration coming in. Do you think it's something you may go back and explore more deeply?
At the moment, I doubt it, but that's for contextual reasons, really. Is that I'm in London. London obviously is a big, complex city, but the part of London I'm in actually has very little. I haven't seen a mosque. I've been up here the last 2 days, and I haven't seen a mosque in the last 2 days as I'm travelling around. Now in the part of London I'm in, it's just Islam is my area is much more Caribbean, West African, and therefore more Christian roots. And so the issues that I face as a pastor and preacher are less to do with contextualization in an Islamic context, because that's just not the demographic in which I live. I could move 10 miles from here to Wembley or Brent or something, and then I'd find, to East London, Tower Hamlets and the Bangladeshi Bengali community, and I would be talking about this all the time. And almost every sermon I'd preach would be trying to make connections with what Muslims believe. I did a seminar last week on Israel Gaza, in our church, because our church thought that would be a helpful thing for us to do. And so obviously we speak into the issues of what's happening in the world, but that's really through the lens of how should we respond to these events in war and politics. But actually, as a pastor and preacher, it's not, at the moment at least, unless I was to move to a much more Islamic area, it isn't really the issue. So again, I think from a distance, there are parts of Britain that are, obviously the Muslim presence is very large and strong, and it's the sort of prominent contextual challenge that a pastor would face. But most of the country's not like that. Most of Britain's still very white, actually. Just I'm in London, which is not. But I'm ministering in a context where that isn't the primary issue. So I doubt I can't see why I would in the immediate term anyway.
Well, look, thank you so much, Andrew, for being with us. It's been fascinating. I loved your book. I hope people go out and buy it. It's a great Christmas read. We're going to have big summer holidays down here.
Oh, I'm so jealous. I've never been to Australia. I'd love to go, but I've just never been. And the idea of being warm in the winter is very appealing.
Look, I think after this book, I'm sure you're going to get some invites. I know lots of clergy and people down here that have read it and are reading it at the moment, really impressed, and hope to see you on our shores one day.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Just quickly, the Bible, the audio Bible that you're presenting for, what's it called, so that people might look out for it?
It's the God's Big Promises Storybook Bible, and I absolutely love it. I loved it anyway. Long before I was asked, actually. But it's basically pitched like the beginner's Bible, so very young. So the first Bible that children would use when it's, But I have found the beginner's Bible has quite a lot of quirky components to it, which and actually I comment on this, but particularly on issues of the illustrations and diversity, but also I think on the way the story is told. And what this Bible does is illustrations are just fantastic and much more representative of the kind of community we're in, but also just narrate the story through the lens really of covenant and promise, and gives you sort of little coloured codes, things where you can see this is like a pink story because this is related to that promise, and this is a green story because it relates to that one. It's been really, really well done. I'm very excited to work on it. So yeah, that's a real treat coming up.
Well, brilliant. Well, thank you once again for joining us. It's been great. Look out for the book. It's a terrific one, Remaking the World, by Andrew Wilson, all out in the bookshops now. A great holiday reading. Well, this has been Mark Powell for AP's Profiles in Christian Living. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to seeing you next time.